And I want to especially thank Chairman Chen for his invitation and for all the staff of the Society for organizing this so smoothly. Now, I want to tell you that this book began in this building. It was September 21st, 2016, and there was a very special speaker. I wonder if you can remember who it was. 2016, September 21st. He was a Japanese. He gave a speech, not here, but in the other room. Yes. Now, it's thanks to Chairman Chan, Mr. Sugihara came, so I was able to come. I listened to his very moving talk. After the talk, I was able to meet him, do an interview, and I met many other people there, including the Israeli consul at the time, Mr. Saji Khani. And that's how this book began. Now, after that, we went to Shanghai, we went to Beijing, we did a lot of interviews. We did many interviews here in Hong Kong, and of course, we did many interviews via email with friends in Israel and in other places.
Sugihara, just for those of you who don't know, his father saved a lot of Jews during the Second World War. He, the Japanese, was a diplomat in Europe, right, Mark?
Well, we will just wait a moment. All will be made clear. But overall, I want to say the book was inspired by many remarkable Jewish people I met over 40 years of living in China, especially in Shanghai, where we lived for 3 years. Because of all the cities in China, Shanghai has the biggest Jewish footprint. And those of you who go to Shanghai, I'm sure if you go around the Puxi district, many of the most impressive buildings you see were built by Jewish entrepreneurs. But unfortunately, I myself am not Jewish. So writing the book, I was quite nervous because I'm a Gentile. I, of course, will make many mistakes. So what I did was I sent all the interviews to the people that we interviewed, asked them to correct it. And then I sent 7 of the 10 chapters to 2 professors. One is Professor Yitzhak Shichor of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the other is Professor Dan Ben-Kanan, who's the only Jewish resident in Harbin since 2002. Now, I haven't met either of these gentlemen. We only corresponded via email. But they gave me a lot of time. They corrected the chapters meticulously. They said, this you must take out, this you must add, and they gave me a lot of additional material. So I cannot find the words to express my gratitude to those 2 professors. So after they'd done the corrections, I could sleep in peace. Okay? So now let's look at the PowerPoint. Now, this quote is from Rabbi Oster in Hong Kong. I think many of you know him. And we chose this for the top of the introduction. And I chose it for the first in our PowerPoint because it's exactly the theme that Chairman Chan was saying. The Jewish history in so many countries is tragic and one of flight, persecution, in some cases worse. But the Jewish experience in China has been a very successful and a very happy one. So I asked the rabbi if he could express this sentiment, and this is what he said. I thought it's so poetic. We'll put it right at the front. Okay? Now I want to show you some Jewish buildings in China and see if you can tell me where they are. Which city are we in here? Not Shanghai, not Guangzhou, we're in the interior. Kaifeng, very good. Yeah, this was the great synagogue of Kaifeng. So this was the largest settled Jewish community in China from the Tang Dynasty onwards. So this was the synagogue at its largest size. How about this one? What city are we in here? Harbin, that's right. There were several Jewish synagogues in Harbin. This was the largest one. Now, which city are we in here? Now, this is also Harbin. Now, this is the synagogue that has been restored in recent years. Now, as I mentioned, in Harbin, there's only one Jewish resident, so it's not a synagogue anymore. But it's become a musical college. So if you go to Harbin, you can see it, and this is how it looked when there were a large number of Jewish people living there. I'm sure you all know this building, yes? And I'm sure you know these two. Anyway, the rabbi was extremely helpful to me. He gave me several interviews. If I had questions I couldn't answer, he supplied the answers. And at one of our earlier talks, someone from the audience asked if the Jews were the chosen people of God. Now, how can someone like myself answer that question? So luckily, the rabbi was present, so I asked him to answer it. So he gave a very good answer. So the Jews arrived, first of all, in China during the Tang Dynasty, and they went to China just like people from all over the world now go to New York. It was the world's most prosperous city. There were people from all over the world there, and so there were Jewish merchants among them. And as I mentioned, the biggest settlement came in Kaifang. But what happened in China is quite different to what happened in Europe, which is that the Jewish people came here, they were well accepted, they were given the rights of Chinese citizens, they could work in the government, they could join the military, they could become teachers, they could become farmers. So they settled down very well in China, and they began to lose their Jewish character. They assimilated. And the communications then were not what they are now. So as they settled in, they assimilated with the Chinese society, they learned Chinese. Hebrew became a language only for the synagogue, and then it was hard to find a rabbi, so there was no rabbi. They would wear Chinese clothes. So gradually they lost the Jewish character, and in the 19th century there were many disasters, civil wars, floods, and so on. The great synagogue of Kaifang was destroyed. There was no money to rebuild it. There was no rabbi to be there. And when the PRC was set up in 1949, I'm sure you know, the government declared 5 official religions, but Judaism was not one of the 5 religions. Now, to us it's a bit strange. This is the world's oldest religion, but the PRC government did not recognize it as an official religion. So the official view of the PRC government is there are now no Jews in China and no Jews in Kaifang. So here we have 5 ladies. Now I think you can probably guess where they are. What's behind? That's right. Now 19 people from Kaifang have made Aliyah to Israel. And these 5 ladies are the most recent ones. They went in February 2016. Now, when they made application to go, the Israeli government was quite suspicious, was not sure of their Jewish credentials, because as you know, in the Cultural Revolution and all the turmoil in China, many documents were lost. Often people had to destroy any evidence that showed a link to people outside of China. So it took 3 years of intense lobbying by them and by, how shall I say, messianic organizations in Israel helping them to get the approval of the Israeli government for them to go. And when they went, they have to first study. They have to study Hebrew, they have to study Jewish traditions and culture, and then they have to take an exam with the chief rabbinate. And only then will they be officially declared Jewish people and Israeli citizens. So it's 19 of them. Okay? So now let's move to another city with a very important Jewish presence. We've shown you 2 pictures from that city already. This is in the north. Harbin, right. So this is a photograph of a Jewish family in Harbin with their Chinese servant. Now, the Jewish presence in Harbin was a result of the China Eastern Railway, which was built by the Russians from Chita in Siberia to Vladivostok. And many Jewish people from Russia moved to Harbin, and this is an example of them. Now, this is one of the several Jewish newspapers in Harbin at the time, and as you can see, it's in Russian, and I'm sure you know the man in the photograph. Yes. The left is a picture of Jewish people involved in the fur trade. It was very big in Manchuria. And the right is the interior of the synagogue that we saw in the second picture. As you can see, it was a very large synagogue. This was a building for old people. So if you had no family or your family had gone abroad, or you were too poor, you had nowhere to live. This was a home for elderly and poor Jewish people. So that gives you an idea of how well established the community was in Harbin at that time. So we call it the capital of Jewish Manchuria. There were up to 25,000 of them living there. And it was a very prosperous community. They had factories, trading firms, banks, hotels, and they had a complete social structure also. They had schools, hospitals, synagogues, music academies. And we called Harbin from 1900 to 1931, we call it the Shanghai of the North, because it was in China, but it was not in China. It was controlled by Russians and controlled by foreigners. There were no taxes. So, as you can see, there were 4,700 trading firms. They were trading with 100 cities around the world. It was an extremely prosperous city. And many people called it Yellow Russia because it was the biggest Russian city outside the borders of Soviet Union. And then, of course, 1931, the Japanese invaded, took over Manchuria, and it lost its international character. Now, this is the cemetery of Harbin, the Jewish cemetery of Harbin. There used to be 3 of them, and they were not well looked after 1949. Some of the tombstones were stolen and so on. But in recent times, the city government made a new one and moved the tombstones to here. So if you go to Harbin, you can visit it. On the right is advertisement for the Hotel Moderne, and we have a section in my book about this. It's a very dramatic story of what happened in this. And on the left, I wanted to show you, this is Professor Ben Canaan. He was the man who helped me greatly with the book. So there he is, and what he's doing there, he's helping the city reconstructing the Jewish buildings. For him, this is one of his missions in life, to make Harbin realize the importance of its Jewish past and to rebuild it and make it a place where Jewish people and other foreigners would like to visit. Okay? So now we move from Harbin. Where are we now? And what's this building? Now, this was built by Sir Victor Sassoon. It was built as a high-end private apartment building, and it's exactly the same today. When we lived in Shanghai, I used to go in there. It's extremely desirable, large apartments, lifts, room for servants, and this is where President Nixon stayed in 1972. And it's a very fine building, and you know, nearly 100 years after it's built, it's still being used. I'm sure you recognize this. Who is this in the middle? Who built the Grosvenor House? That's him. Now, why do I choose this picture to show Sir Victor? Well, he had many interests in life, but this was one of them. Yes, that's right. That's right. Now, how about this person? Yes. So, Sir Victor was the richest, probably the richest person in Shanghai, and Silas Hardoon was probably the second richest. He was also Jewish, also from a Baghdadi background. And on the left side is a photograph of his wife, and this is a very interesting story. His wife was not Jewish, she was a Eurasian, and she was a very devout Buddhist. So he married her, and many in the community were not happy about that, but that was his decision. And he and Sir Victor both made a fortune out of opium, and then they put the money from that into property, and they made several fortunes out of property. And this is the Nanjing Duel, and this was mainly developed by Silas Hardoon, and he owned most of the buildings here, and it became the premier commercial street in Shanghai and indeed the whole of China. So many department stores and other brand stores moved into this road, and he collected very good rents from them. So you can see the level of profits that Sassoon made from the opium, but after it was declared illegal, then he moved the money into property. And with his money, Silas Hardoon built the biggest private house in Shanghai, an enormous house with many gardens. And his wife was a very devout Buddhist. So this was her contribution to the garden. And she arranged for many Buddhist monks to live there, and there was also a Buddhist school inside this park. Now, Mr. Hardoon was not especially observant, but he donated money to build this synagogue in Shanghai, and it's not standing anymore, but it is very famous because during World War II, these are the members of the Mir Yeshiva from Poland. And this is the only yeshiva, religious school, all of whose members escaped and lived safely through World War II. And then after World War II, they went to Israel and the United States. So this is a very remarkable photograph. And during the war, they were able to come to this synagogue and continue their studies. Now, this was the biggest synagogue in Shanghai. It was built with money from Sir Victor Sassoon, and it's still standing today. It belongs to the City Education Bureau, but they allow the community to use it sometimes for events, but they won't give it back to them. So now we move on to World War II, and I think this is a part of the history you're probably quite familiar with. From the time that Hitler took power, Jewish people started to leave Germany and other parts of Europe. So this is taken in 1934. So these people were able to leave in a normal way. They were able to buy a ticket. They were able to bring some of their belongings with them. And here they are arriving in Shanghai on a regular cargo ship from Europe. But as the numbers got more and more, there wasn't enough space, so they had to build bunks for them. And this is a photo in 1938 of Chabad Lubavitch students arriving in Shanghai, and they gave us permission to use this photograph, so I'm very grateful to them. And we put this photograph on the front page. And why do you think we chose this to put on the front page? Now, the front page, remember, you can't have a caption. The photo must be self-explanatory. So why do we choose this photograph? Well, they're evidently Jewish people, religious people, and there are Chinese characters, so we must be in China. So yes, that's the reason. So during World War II, as the chairman mentioned, 25,000 to 30,000 refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees, came to Shanghai. Conditions of life were not easy. 1,000 of them died of various causes. But they were not killed by the Japanese. And this is a very remarkable thing. 1942 in July, the Gestapo representative in Tokyo came to Shanghai and said, okay, you Japanese, you're in charge of these 30,000 Jews, now you must eliminate them. And he gave them 3 choices. But the Japanese refused to do it. So if you read the book, you can understand why they didn't do that. Now, how did so many Jews get to Shanghai? This is also an extraordinary story. And a major reason was that several diplomats from Asia helped them. So this is probably the most famous one, Mr. He Fengshan. He was the Republic of China's consul in Vienna. And he, of his own accord, started to issue visas because he could not tolerate the treatment being given to Jews that he saw around him. His superior in Berlin told him to stop doing it, but he continued to do it. So here's one of the visas he issued, and there's a photograph of him. And this is one of the visas he issued. So that's the lady who got the visa. Now, this is the father of Mr. Sugihara, who came to give the talk. And he was the vice consul of Japan in Kaunas in Lithuania. And this was the scene he saw from his window one morning. It was about 6 o'clock. He just got out of bed. He opened the window and he took a photograph. So he saw all these people lined up. They could not get a visa to anywhere. So he, like Mr. He Fengshan, started to give visas despite orders from his superiors not to do it. So there he is having a diplomatic dinner with some Nazi officials. Now, this is a man that few people have heard of. His name is Wang Tifu. He was a diplomat of the Manchukuo government in Berlin. Now, Mr. Wang was a polyglot. Mr. Wang spoke German. He's one of the few Chinese who met Hitler and conversed with Hitler. So in my book, you can read an account of his going to the Chancellery, attending events with Hitler, and what he thought of him. So like the other two, Mr. Wang started to give out many visas. So these are three gentlemen who made a great contribution to allowing so many Jews to escape and arrive in Shanghai. Now, there's one other man I want to mention. This is a Japanese. He's called Kotsuji Setsuzo. So there he is. Now, he was also an extraordinary man. He was initially a Protestant minister, and he was the only Japanese in the 30s who could speak and read Hebrew. He spent a lot of time in Manchuria. He got to know many Jewish people in Harbin, and he became increasingly pro-Jewish. So during the war in Japan, he made a lot of efforts to protect the Jews who were in Japan, help them to go to China if they wanted. He put his life at risk on some occasions. And finally, at the end of his life, he converted to Orthodox Judaism, had a circumcision in a Jerusalem hospital, and he's buried on the Mount of Olives. So this is a really extraordinary story, Mr. Kotsuji. Okay, so the war ends. As we know, China is engulfed in civil war and inflation. So the Jewish people in China, whether they're refugees or long-term residents, nearly all of them leave. So they go to the US, Canada, Australia, Israel. Israel set up 1948. They send representative there. He issues travel documents, enable them to go to Israel. So this is our friend Sir Victor, yes. So he didn't marry until right at the end. So this lady here was his nurse. So he finally married her right at the end. And when he left Shanghai, he went to Bahamas. Why did he go to Bahamas? Tax haven, no communists, good climate, and racing. He loved racing. So yes, so he left Shanghai and he moved to Bahamas. I'm sure some of you know this building. This was the home of the Kuduri family in Shanghai. And after the war, they donated it. I put it in quotation marks. They donated it to the new government. And now it's a youth palace. So it's being used now all the time by young people in Shanghai for different activities. So Sir Victor, of course, is very, very savvy. So Sir Victor started to move his money out of China even in 1930s. I mean, no one could see what was going to happen. So he started moving in 1930s, and after 1945, if you wanted to rent one of his apartments in Shanghai, you had to pay in Hong Kong dollars or British sterling or in US dollars. You could not pay in Chinese money because he saw what was going to happen. So he didn't get all his money out, but I think he got a much more than most other people. Okay, so let's now move on. Israel's been founded. Now, the Republic of China was always very supportive of Israel. Sun Yat-sen wrote a letter in support of the State of Israel. The RSC government supported the Balfour Declaration just a year after it was issued. In the key vote in the United Nations, the ROC abstained, and in 1949 she recognized Israel and then voted to admit it into the United Nations. But, as you know, Mao Zedong took a different view. He was more revolutionary. So he supported revolutionary causes, Muslim causes. So there was no diplomatic relations between the PRC and Israel until January 1992. Anybody tell me who this is? His name is Shir Eisenberg. He was the man that pioneered trade between China and Israel. And I was lucky enough to meet him in Beijing because he lived in Beijing. He lived in a service apartment near to the airport. I mean, he didn't live there every day, but that was his headquarters. And I was once able to have an interview with him. And he wouldn't tell us about his business dealings because he tried to keep them secret. But he told me that he got one of the last boats to leave Rotterdam, and he spent the war in Shanghai and in Japan. So he had a feeling for these two countries that many people would not have. So he started to do trade with China in 1970s, years before anyone else, and especially before other Israelis did it. So in 1979, in February, he organized the first visit by Israeli military industrial delegation to Beijing. And they arrived and they were put in a hotel near to Beijing airport. And like most foreigners at the time, they wanted to go to the friendship store where we used to buy Chinese products. But China was so afraid that anyone would see them that they had to go at 3 a.m. So the staff had to come back at 3 a.m. so they could do their purchases and be back in the hotel before anyone else came to the shop. Yeah. So China became the biggest export market for Israel for a period. Now, this is even more extraordinary. Now, we're not in PRC anymore. Where is this? 双喜，我们在哪一个国家？对。This is a military parade on the October 10th in the ROC. And this is a rocket which is developed with Israeli technology. So the Israeli arms exporters sold both to China and also to Taiwan. They also developed the Israel nuclear industry, the Taiwan nuclear industry. So if you read my book, you'll read a detailed account of that. That's also something you cannot imagine. So finally, 1992, the two countries normalized relations, and Chairman Chan knows much better than we do. The development of these relations, especially in the last 5 years, has been quite extraordinary. But my friends in Israel are a little bit sad because they say that whilst China has been extremely aggressive in the economic field, cultural field, agriculture, in many sectors, in developing relations with Israel, there's no, as they call it, peace dividend. I mean, China is a very powerful country in the world now. It has a lot of diplomatic weight, but it's not using this weight to broker a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinian side. Now, who do you recognize in this photograph? I'm sure you recognize two people. That's right. Now, this is a really extraordinary project. It's in Shantou University. It's the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. And this was a result of a donation by Mr. Lee, $130 million to Technion, which is in Tel Aviv. It was the biggest donation they've ever received. And as the counterparty, they are setting up this high-tech institute in Shantou University as a kind of MIT of China. Now, Mr. Lee was one of the earliest Chinese investors in Israel, and this was one of his most successful investments. He put seed capital into this company, which does, GSP, and then it listed, and he made, I think, $143 million from this listing. So he gave 130 million of it to Technion, and then they set up this institute. This is another of Mr. Lee's investments in Israel. This is a big desalination plant. I think it's the biggest in Israel. Okay. Now, sorry, I'm talking too much. Now I just want to show you some Jewish people who've had a very great impact on China. So please, can you say who has the greatest impact? Of all the Jewish people in China, who has had the biggest impact? Have a guess. Thank you. Very good. Here he is. Yes. There he is. That's right. Now, if he came back to China today, I think he would be a little bit puzzled, find it hard to understand what's going on. But anyway, I think he ranks number one. Yeah. And if you chat to people in the mainland and you say, 犹太人, 谁是犹太人? This is usually the response you get. I would say Mr. Einstein is probably the most famous Jewish person in China. And if you ask a mum what she wants her son to be, she would say, yeah, I would like him to be like Mr. Einstein. And who's this? Freud. Now, my father was Freudian. He was a psychiatrist. He followed Mr. Freud. So we did interviews in Shanghai with doctors in the mental health field, and they said that he was the most influential. He is the father of psychiatry in China. And as you can imagine, in the early years, it was very difficult for Chinese to accept his concepts of sexuality. But still, I put him in here because he's the father of mental health in China in this respect. Yes. Without Kissinger, I think we would have no normalization with America, especially at such an early date. I mean, Nixon was a convinced anti-communist. I think it's extraordinary that he was able to be convinced that it would be in America's interest to normalize with China. So I think only someone like Mr. Kissinger could do it. And finally, I want to put in the photo of the other professor who helped me so much, Professor Shishor. And as I say, he and Professor Ben-Kain had edited 7 of the 10 chapters. So those chapters have no mistakes in them. The other ones maybe, but not. Okay, that's the end of my talk. So let's please have questions.
Let me begin by asking you, why were you interested in the Jews since you were a kid? Did you have a neighbor or something that was really nice to you, give you ice cream or something? Is that why?
Well, my father was a spendthrift, but he married a rich woman. And with her money, he bought a very nice house in a very nice neighborhood in London.
London.
And this is the neighborhood where the chief rabbi lives.
Ah.
So for about 6 years, I used to walk around. I saw many Jewish people. There were synagogues there in the neighborhood. But then my father's spendthrifting habits caught up with him. The bank manager said, we're not lending you any more money. So we had to sell out and move to a much less prosperous area, and there were no Jewish people there. So that was my initial imprint, success, fame, status.
When did your intellectual interest in Jewish people begin? When you were a kid, it's really more, maybe, I don't know if there's the right word, emotive, whereas later you must have gained an intellectual interest.
Well, I think the interview with Mr. Eisenberg was the key.
What year was that?
This would be about 94.
And you were working for who at the time?
For Reuters. I was working for
Reuters.
No, SCMP. Because he had his home there. He had an office there in Beijing. I knew several people in his office. They used to explain to me what he was doing. And he did all kinds of trade between Israel and China. But it was all below the radar. He never gave interview. He didn't want anyone to know what he was doing. And meeting him and listening to his life, it was unlike any life I'd heard before.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, he was born in Munich. His parents were Polish, quite Orthodox family. He escaped, I think he wasn't even 20. He got on this boat from Rotterdam. He arrives in Shanghai. He spends 3 years in Shanghai. I don't know who looked after him. I mean, his parents were in Europe. Then he goes to Japan. He marries a lady of mixed race in Japan. And after the war, as you can see, most of the Jewish people left, but he stayed. And then he did trade with Japan and the West. Then he went to South Korea after the war and did a lot of trade with South Korea. He built up a large fortune. He founded the Israel Corporation, one of the biggest companies in Israel. And he became one of the leading entrepreneurs of Israel. But he was a man who loved to have a challenge. He could have just lived in Israel and enjoyed his wealth, but no, he wanted to do something. So one of my friends working in his company said he had his private plane, a former Israeli Air Force pilot running it, and he used to fly. He said one day he was flying from Israel to Beijing, and he was flying over Kazakhstan. And the phone rang, and it was the Kazakh president. And the president said, Mr. Eisenberg, I have some projects here in Kazakhstan. Can I interest you in them? Would you like to invest in them? And Eisenberg said, I'm sorry, I have to meet President Jiang. I'm in tomorrow. Let's have this meeting later. I mean, he was a businessman of that level. So when I heard these stories and then I met him himself, I thought, this is something very unusual. What's going on here? And then I had the good fortune to go to Shanghai. And as I mentioned, if you're in Shanghai, you cannot escape the Jewish presence. And there are many Jewish people living there. There were 7 synagogues before, now there are only 2. And one day when I was in Shanghai, we had the chief Sephardic rabbi came from Israel. As you know, in Israel, there are 2 chief rabbis, and this was the first visit by either of them to China since 1949. So I said, this is a big news. Something big is going to happen. So I wrote in my computer, China returns synagogue to Israel. I wrote this in my computer, and I said to my assistant, when I telephone you can issue the news.
What year?
This would be about 98. So we go to the synagogue I showed you the photo of in Shanghai, and there were 6 rabbis with him, and they go to the, where they keep the sacred texts, where they used to keep the sacred texts, and he came out, and then we asked him, Chief Rabbi, can we ask, is the PRC government returning the synagogue to you? And he gave a very long answer in Hebrew, which we couldn't understand.
It was translated, I assume.
Oh, the rabbis could speak all the languages in the world, okay. I can assure you. Yeah. And it was a very diplomatic answer. Our relations with China are very good. Blah, 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 blah. But no, they wouldn't return the synagogue to them. So I went back to my office. I rang up a man called Pan Guang. I'm sure you know him.
Pan Guang. Yes, I know.
Very, very well-informed person. I said,
Jewish expert in China.
I said, Professor Pan, why not? The Jews don't proselytize. They're not out to convert Chinese to Judaism. They're a very prosperous and useful member of your community. They're doing no harm to China. I said, why not? Just give them this building. What damage is it to China? And he said, we would like to do it. We in Shanghai would like to do it, but this has to be approved by Beijing. And if we give them the synagogue, how about the Baha'i and the Baptists and the Methodists? Everyone else will come and say, look, we want our properties before 49. So he said, we can let them use it. We don't deny its past, but we can't give them back the ownership. And then, of course, in Shanghai, you meet many Jewish people who come back to see where they lived or their parents or grandparents lived during World War II. Oh, I'm sure you've done it yourself. And you meet people and you talk to them and they tell you the stories about the war and what happened to them in the war. And it's... So the interest deepens with all these...
So you were wrong. Finally, I found something that Mark is wrong. I found another mistake.
Many things. Yes.
So they were not trying to return. So why is the chief rabbi in China? You don't know?
Well, I think there were reasons which neither China or Israel wanted to say, I think. Because he's a person of such eminence. He couldn't have just come for just a goodwill visit. They must have been speaking about something else, but they didn't want to make it public and that.
So you either know it, don't want to tell us, or you don't know it?
No, I'm afraid I don't know. I'm ashamed to say I don't know. I'm a very poor reporter. I didn't find out. Yeah.
Can I correct one mistake that you made?
Please.
Technion is not in Tel Aviv. It's in Haifa.
Haifa, excuse me. Okay, thank you very much.
And the photograph, the far left one, is the president of Technion, Peretz Levy, and he has been on our campus right here.
Okay.
Let me go back to Eisenberg a little bit for a second. What do you think was the motivation for him to sell weapons to China? Is it just all money, or you think the government is behind it? That there's some deals between Israel government and Beijing that caused them to sell? Or is it just an individual wanting to make more money? And
No. From what I wrote in the book, it was after China's invasion of Vietnam, and this was a big defeat. 79.
79.
A big defeat for China. Right. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed.
Correct.
China did not achieve its aim. Vietnam did not withdraw from Cambodia, and the PLA realized how backward they were. They'd been caught in the Maoist universe for 30 years. The rest of the world had moved on. So we have to modernize rapidly. Where are we going to get modern weapons? They can't get them from Soviet Union. They can't get them from the US. They can't get them from NATO. Where can we get them? They can get them from Israel. Now,
didn't America stop Israel from doing that?
Well, one second. So, I mean, I think you know much better than I, but I think in Israel, I think the weapon industry is very carefully monitored by the government. And so the government decided we're willing to approve this. So the timing is just after the war with Vietnam. So Eisenberg was the facilitator of this. He wasn't the creator of this. He himself didn't have enough power to initiate this kind of trade. But because he was there, he had the means, and it was his plane they used to fly to Beijing, which was actually very convenient because it was not...
Fire weapons.
No, just to bring the delegation. So it wasn't an Israeli plane, it wasn't a Chinese plane, and it was a private plane. So he was the facilitator, yes.
Why during the Second World War, maybe I'm wrong, you seem to indicate that they were not in a concentration camp during the Second World War, were they?
After this Gestapo representative came, the Japanese refused to
eliminate them,
to kill the Jews, but they set up what is called segregated area. So some people use the word ghetto, some people don't use the word ghetto, but for me, ghetto means Warsaw, Lodz, the ghettos of Europe, where the Jews were not able to leave, and it was the step before they were taken to the death camps. Now, the ghetto in Shanghai, they were not free to go anywhere, but if they had a permit, they could get out to work. And the aim was not to eliminate them. The official Japanese reason was that the numbers were so large, there was not enough space, in the French concession, international concession, for them to be. So there was this surplus of refugees who just come, so we have to put them there. So I suspect the answer is somewhere in between. It was to some extent a concession to the Nazis to make a segregated area. But from my research, people did not die from being killed by Japanese. They died of illness, lack of food, overcrowding. I mean, there were causes, but they were not directly targeted by Japanese.
Was it really the only reason why the Japanese didn't kill the Jews? Is no place for it? Or is there some other reason, some moral reason or some other reason why they didn't listen to the Nazis?
I think Japanese and Chinese are the same. They have a great admiration for Jews. We lived 4 years in Japan. There were many books about how the Jews are a special race, very talented. So I think there was no benefit. There was no prejudice that I'm afraid we find in Europe against the Jews. Secondly, there are many Jewish people in America. In the Japanese government, there were different factions, and the more enlightened faction said, we have to keep relations with the Americans. So what's the point in doing something that will alienate the Americans so badly? Thirdly, what's the physical benefit? I mean, in Germany, if the Nazis expel a Jew from his house, they take his house, they take his artworks, they take his money. Well, that didn't exist because these people were refugees. And fourthly, this is what a Chinese scholar in Shanghai said. He said the Japanese were looking very carefully at the war in Russia. And Stalingrad was the turning point. Stalingrad was the first major defeat by the Nazis.
Winter.
So when the Japanese saw what happened in Stalingrad, they realized they were on the wrong side. They were going to lose. So why do something which is going to further alienate? So he said if the Nazis had won in Stalingrad, if the Nazis had captured Moscow, perhaps the story would be different.
Yeah.
Because if you're a Chinese scholar, you cannot praise Japanese in the war.
Say it again?
You cannot praise Japanese during World War II.
Right.
If you're a Chinese scholar, you can't praise them.
Correct. Okay.
So my question was, 日本人有没有救犹太人的命?
Did Japanese save Jews'
So
in
he
China.
gave an answer for about 20 minutes, full of very relevant points. But he would
not say
He
it.
cannot say they saved the Jews. No.
Right. Okay.
But my informed judgment would be they did save them. Yes.
Right. Well, just for your
But
film.
I don't know what others think.
Let me check. How many of you were at the Sugihara program? Only 3 hands, 4 hands. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, you missed a lot. Watch out for the program announcement of Asia Society, okay? You will miss good stuff. And by the way, Mr. Sugihara, in one of his, whatever writing he did afterwards, put his talk at the Asia Society, a photograph of it on it. So we're very, very happy. Huh? And by the way, we also try to invite He Fengshan's daughter, the ROC diplomat, to come, and eventually the negotiation break down. So if any of you want to help, let me know. But anyway, but the other 2 people that you mentioned, Wang Zhefu, was he also ROC
He was
diplomat?
Manzhouguo.
Oh, so was he Chinese or Japanese?
Well, he was a Zhongguoren, from
Chinese.
from Dongbei.
Uh-huh.
And I read his, well, not his autobiography, but the book.
Manchuria.
He dictated this book to a Chinese journalist just before he died.
Oh.
So
When did he die?
he died about 2002.
Okay.
So his story is that he was resisting the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. He was arrested. He was, perhaps not tortured, beaten up by the Japanese, and they discovered he was a polyglot. He was a very smart guy. So they said, you have 2 alternatives. We can keep you in prison, we will keep beating you, or you can leave and join the new diplomatic service of Manchukuo. Which do you want?
Right.
So he decides to join the diplomatic service. He speaks German, so they sent him to Berlin. And just like He Fengshan, he sees what's going on in the streets. He's very disturbed by it. And as I say in the book, he describes going to the new chancellery that Hitler had built, this enormous building. And he describes...
Representing Manchuria, which means representing Japanese.
Yes.
Japan in China, if you will.
But it means that he has an entree, he has a protection.
Right.
And he starts to give out the visas to Jews.
While he was in where?
Berlin.
Oh, okay.
And the Japanese had a plan to set up a Jewish homeland in Manchuria. It's called the Fugu Plan. So initially, the Manchukuo government encouraged him to give visas because they wanted Jews to come to Manchuria and they wanted them to settle there.
Yeah.
But he continued to do it even after he was told not to because of personal reasons. But of course, after the war was ended, he was arrested by the Soviet Union. He was sent to labor camp in the Soviet Union for, I think, 12 years. He comes back to China, and what happens?
The Chinese put him in jail.
Of course, he's arrested again because he
was for Manchuria.
Manchurian government.
Right.
So he's in labor camp, and then he's sent to countryside. So
in China also.
In China also. So it's only very late in life he can finally settle down in Harbin and look over his past life. So there's no time to do what they do in Jerusalem, which is if you want to go to the Righteous Among the Nations garden, there has to be meticulous investigation.
Right.
Who did you save?
Right.
What are their names?
Right.
What are the documents? Where they're living?
Right.
I mean, this all takes a long time.
Right.
Well, there was no time for this.
Right.
So I was a bit nervous about putting his name in because he's not in the memorial in Jerusalem.
No, Yad Vashem.
But I thought I'm not.
Path of the Righteous.
This isn't a very heavy academic book. No one else has written about him, and the accounts of meeting Hitler are just so good. So I thought let's put this in. So he was another. I think he also deserves.
Can you say a little bit about the second Japanese that sorry for my ignorance, I didn't know about that. The other gentleman, what's his name? Yamata?
No, it's Setsuji Kotsuji. Oh. Setsuzo Kotsuji.
Okay.
Now he was a very unusual Japanese in that he became a Protestant pastor. He studied in California, I think, like you did.
Where?
in California. Sorry, I
Okay.
forget the name. And so he comes back to Japan. But in the course of his studies of theology, he becomes very interested in the Old Testament. So he learns Hebrew. He learns to read and speak it. And then he's invited by the South Manchurian Railway Company to Manchuria and be their advisor on Jewish affairs. And the South Manchuria Railway Company is a very extraordinary institution. I'd love to write a book about it. It's like the sort of government unit that ran Manchuria. So in the course of this work, he goes off into Harbin. He meets many Jewish people in Harbin, including rabbis. And he's very impressed by them. And within the Japanese army in Manchuria, there's a faction which is extremely pro-Jewish. So for 3 years, they have a Far East region Jewish conference. And they invite all the leading Jews of Harbin and other cities in China and from Japan for this annual meeting. And the purpose of the meeting is to say that we, the Japanese, we support you, we are helping you, we want you to help us develop this new state. And this is of enormous value to the Jewish community, especially with what's going on in the world at that time. So Mr. Kotsuji comes to these meetings and he speaks in Hebrew. Can you imagine? Yeah. In this big hall in Harbin, full of Japanese officers, Chinese officers, Jewish people, and he's speaking to them in Hebrew. So after this service is over, he goes back to Japan. And within the Japanese government, of course, there are different factions. There are some very fascist factions. There are some more enlightened factions. So he does the best he can to lobby for the Jewish people and prevent any actions against them within Japan. And then after the war, as I mentioned, he becomes more and more Jewish and more pro-Jewish, and eventually dies in Israel.
Did he... why was the faction within the Japanese army or government in Manchuria that is so pro-Jewish? Is it pragmatism that they know that, if Hitler had not killed so many Jews, maybe they would not have lost the war? A lot of those Americans, in Los Alamos or wherever, they are Jews that eventually developed the bomb and this and that. Is it for pragmatic reason? Because it cannot be religious reasons, because the Japanese are hardly Christians or Jewish.
Well, the main leaders of this pro-Jewish faction, these were very internationalized. They were not normal Japanese. They spoke Russian, or they spoke German. They had visited Europe. They had seen what is going on in Europe.
Military men?
Military in the Guangdong Army. In the intelligence unit of the Guangdong Army. Mm-hmm. So they saw what was going on. And as I say, they arrived there with a great admiration for them. So they thought, well, Jewish people are very talented. They have expertise. They have money. They're being driven out of Europe. We are building this new state in Manchukuo. We are having a lot of difficulty getting the Chinese citizens of Manchukuo to accept it. So these are very talented immigrants, which we can make use of. And of course, many people in the Japanese government thought that to go to war with America was a catastrophe. As you know, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who was charged with the attack on Pearl Harbor, said, we must not do this. If we do this, we will lose. The American steel production is, am I right, 12 times that of Japan. Once we attack America, we lose the war. So many people thought like that. So these people were planning on war with China, perhaps with France and Holland in Southeast Asia, but not to attack America. So this would be the thinking of these more enlightened Japanese officers.
Let me turn to another line of thoughts. Let's go to Victor Sassoon. You have a slide that says 60 to 70% of the opium trade were by those two guys, Hardun and Sassoon, right? Anybody know where is Hardun Road? What is the new name now? That's where Hanglong Plaza 66 is. Anyway, what do you think caused Victor Sassoon to be so crazily smart to begin to sell and get out in 1931? Begin to sell down his assets. What was the cause? What did he see that other people didn't see? Was it the Japanese? Because 31 was the year that Japan began to invade China.
Yeah, I think he saw there will be a war between China and Japan. I mean, not just in Manchuria, but yeah, I think he saw a war between China and Japan. And perhaps he saw that this war would involve other powers, perhaps Britain, perhaps the United States. And he had a lot of assets.
Did he stay in China during the whole World War II?
No.
He already went to Bahamas.
He was not in China. Not in China during the war. Sorry, I'm not sure exactly where he was, but he made the decision to go to Bahamas, I think, very soon after 45. I mean, again, well before other people. I mean, other people hang on to 47, 48, even 49, but no, he had moved. Yeah.
What happened to the Sassoon wealth? There is a Victor Sassoon who's now living in London. Many of you, I assume, probably know him, right? A banker. So what happened to
the China British Business Council? He's the chairman of it. Yeah. So no, the Sassoon family became quite anglicized. They went to these expensive schools in Britain. They joined the British ruling class. No, they've done very well. One of the most famous World War I poets that we used to read at school. He's
one of the Sassoons.
Yeah, he wrote poems from the trenches. Very, very remarkable poems. One of the founders of the Royal Air Force was a Sassoon. Yeah.
What happened to the Hardoons?
Now, he and his wife had no children of their own. They had 21 adopted children, of whom half adopted the Chinese name and half adopted the non-Chinese name. But after he died, he had this enormous wealth, and there were these lawsuits over who should receive the money. And his will, he left it to his wife, all to his wife.
And he died in China?
He died in China, but
roughly what year?
31.
31.
But many people contested this will. Some said he did not marry his wife in accordance with Jewish ceremony, therefore the marriage is not legal. So others claimed the money. She wins the lawsuit in the end, but it's absolutely grueling for her. And then she dies not long afterwards, and we've now got 21 claimants for the assets. Now we have World War I, World War II is going on. Then we have Civil War. So in the end, no, the money is the fortune is lost, and the communist government comes, and they of course take over most of the assets. So.
Can I correct one more point in
Please.
your set? That's relating to Henry Kissinger. I was supposed to be with Henry last Friday at his office, but he eventually had to travel, so I have to change it. It really wasn't just Henry who was, advocating open relationship with China. In fact, there's a whole cohort of it. I think you may know some of them, including a journalist, Doug Barnett, right? Robert Scalapino, who was the first speaker of the Asia Society Hong Kong Center in 1991. And there's a few others. In particular, Mike Mansfield, the majority Senate leader. In fact, Mike is a good friend of mine. I serve on his foundation. He and Nixon met every week to discuss whatever. One is a majority leader, one is the president. And the main topic, he told me, was China. So I asked him, I said, was Henry in the room? He said, no. But the way he said it, I understood to mean Henry didn't qualify.
I see.
Henry was just one of the cabinet members. But that is not to take away, from any contribution that Henry has made to this discussion. But Nixon was really, and Mike Mansfield were the two that were leading the charge. And that's maybe one reason why Nixon picked Henry Kissinger, knowing that he shares his view on that. The other one is Lucian Pye, the MIT professor, whom I think might have even spoken here. So no doubt that Henry has made great contribution to this regard. But let me ask you one or two more questions before opening it to the floor. You said nothing about the religious aspect of the Judaism. In China, does it come into the picture at all that the religious aspect? Today, you go to Israel. You have the extremists, the real ultra orthodox, but most of the people today are not religious at all in Israel. Did Judaism play a major role in China for the Jews in China?
Well, in Beijing, Shanghai, I interviewed the rabbis, and they're both Chabad Lubavitch rabbis.
Yes.
I think you know them very well.
Yes.
They are very passionate, very devoted. And they're missionaries, but their mission is not convert the Chinese. No, their mission is to bring all the Jews of Shanghai or Beijing into the Jewish family. So for them, the religious aspect is critical. So the Rabbi Greenberg in Shanghai gave me a lot of time, and I first said, well, would you like to get the synagogues back? He said, yes, we would like to, but that's the decision of Chinese government. I said, would you like Judaism to be an official religion in China? I mean, from my thinking, it should be. It's the oldest religion in the world. And he gave a very long answer, but I can't remember all of it. It's too complex for me. But in the end, he said, look, where we are now, we are able to have our own religious meetings, our own community, our own activities. But if we were an official religion, the head of it would have to be a Chinese. We would be under the Chinese government. And there is no rabbi in China, a Chinese rabbi, able to do that. So actually, we're better off as we are, which is well protected, left to our own devices, and we're able to carry on. And we have very good relations with the Chinese government. But we're not... we're not directly under the...
Yeah, understand. Well, let me announce a program which is a little bit ahead of time. Because of time, I know that some of you are looking at your watch. We're going to have a program right here where Rabbi Osher, together with the Islam Imam of Hong Kong, will come here to have a dialogue. And I will be moderating that session. I think that will be a fun one to attend, right? So watch out for our announcement. In fact, it was really through the Holocaust and the Tolerance Center in Hong Kong, Glenn Steinman and so forth, who is making the arrangement. It was our idea, Asia Society's idea, but he really likes it. So we're going to have a private lunch pretty soon to map out the way. Probably in the fall, we're going to bring you that program. Okay, let's open to the can you have the light on, please, and see if any of the audience would like to ask. In the front.
Mark, you mentioned a telegram from Sun Yat-sen. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about that. But you didn't mention that Sun Yat-sen had a Jewish bodyguard. Do you know about that?
Yes, we have a chapter on him. Well, not a chapter, section on him in the book. It's a very extraordinary story.
Very interesting, yes.
No, Sun Yat-sen was Christian, as you know. And he was also a person who knew many people. So I think he was psychologically well-intentioned, well-inclined toward Jewish people. And they wished to have their own homeland in Palestine. Well, he considered that quite proper. And so he wrote a letter, in support of it. His bodyguard, he's worth a Hollywood movie. Well, you don't have to make anything up. Called Two Gun Cohen. So if you read the book, you read all about his
movie also, right? Is there a movie on that? Anyway.
Well, please make one. I mean, please.
I thought that that's already
fund one. You will get a lot back on your investment. I guarantee. Yeah. amazing. Yeah.
Talking about bodyguard.
Yeah.
The bodyguard of another Jewish leader told me this. That is David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion's bodyguard eventually wanted to have a very successful career in the Mossad, and is a dear friend of mine. And he told me that David Ben-Gurion was so respectful of the Chinese that in his, I think it was 1956, official visit to Paris, he was received by de Gaulle. And you know de Gaulle is very tall, and David Ben-Gurion is my height. And in fact, they were in a car. They have to put several cushions so that the people can see David Ben-Gurion from the window. The question, however, is what was the main topic of discussion between de Gaulle and David Ben-Gurion?
Chinese bodyguards, was it?
There's two questions. One of them is China. And just like Napoleon said, let the dragon lie. The day that the dragon awakes, it will change the world. David Ben-Gurion and de Gaulle share that view.
Yeah.
So the Jewish people and the Chinese people are perhaps connected in many other ways. Yes, any other question that from Saul? Yes, sir.
Sorry, Mark. I'm just interested in your view. Why did the Republic of China abstain, do you think, in the vote to establish the State of Israel? Given the picture that you've painted, which was generally there was not this large-scale discrimination. What's the reason, do you feel, for the abstention?
Well, we're what, 1947, 48. There's a civil war in China.
The first vote was November 47.
Yeah, November 47. So the RSC government is in a perilous situation.
Yeah.
It needs allies. It needs support from many countries to stay in power. Israel had not yet been established. So I think it was that would be the thinking of the RSC government at that particular moment. But I think temperamentally, they were always in support of Israel and the Jewish people.
It's quite striking, though, because the first country to recognize them was the Soviet Union, where, of course, large-scale pogroms, discrimination, and the country responsible for the mandate also abstained. So it is quite strange.
Could it be that?
Could you?
No, I'm just. I want to ask you, following this gentleman's question, could it be that Chiang Kai-shek himself, being a Christian, influenced by his wife, could that also come into the picture, or is that an indication from historic documents that may be one of the factors? I'm sure it is. Any other? No more? At the very back, the last row.
You mentioned several theories why the Japanese were not interested in executing the final solution on Jewish people. One that I've heard once was that Jewish financiers were helping Japan earlier, at the end of the 19th century, to finance to build up the army or something like that. And I don't know whether you've come across anything along those lines.
Well, you're completely accurate, because it was during the Russo-Japanese War.
Do you remember?
1904, 1905. You remember the Russians sent the Baltic Fleet. Baltic Fleet.
Long way.
It had to go through the Cape of Good Hope. The British wouldn't let them through the Suez Canal, so they had to go all the way, Baltic Sea, Atlantic, in order to fight the Japanese Navy. So in this critical moment, the Japanese need to buy more armaments to prepare to fight the Baltic fleet of Tsarist Russia. So the Japanese send envoys to London and to raise money to finance these purchases. And the British financiers and the French financiers and the German financiers, they don't want to upset the Russians, because they're allies. So they refuse to give them money. But there is a Jewish financier who remembers the pogroms in Russia, and he has no such qualms, and he is quite willing to lend them the money, and
Who's that?
they use this money to buy arms.
Who's
So
that?
when the Baltic fleet arrives, they are humiliated, they're destroyed by the Japanese Navy, and this is the end of Russo-Japanese War. Now, the name is in the book. I think it's CSOFF. Is that right, Jacob?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm but you're completely right. And remember, the people I'm talking about in the book, they are members of Japanese military. So the ones who are pro-Jewish, these were people who had been to military academies, who had studied all the history. So yes, this gave them a very strong sympathy for the Jewish side, because of that act by this financier.
One last. The gentleman in blue.
Thank you. Mark, just interested from your perspective as a journalist, particularly with the CMP, how the coverage of the Jewish people and also Israel has evolved in your time here.
Well, when I arrived in China in the 80s, my first press conference, the foreign ministry spokesman said, "We in China, we do not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries." And then an Arab journalist asked him a question about the West Bank. And he then gave a denunciation of the Israeli army in the West Bank. And we thought this was a bit strange. We're not interfering in affairs of other countries, but there's a very strong condemnation. So there was a complete 360-degree change during my time there. So initially, China followed the Maoist left-wing, very pro-Islamic view, very much against Israel. But as Ronnie knows much better, after 1992, this has completely changed. And now China sees Israel in an extremely favorable light. Chinese companies invested heavily in Israel. Some said they now invest more than the United States. Is that possible? No, not maybe number 2 now. But they've invested in major infrastructure projects, in a lot of startups. So the treatment now in the Chinese press of Israel is very, very favorable. And just recently in Zhuhai, they had a China investment seminar. And there were many Israeli entrepreneurs, there were many Chinese entrepreneurs, many projects were discussed. So now the coverage is now very favorable.
I got a...
In the attitude, what caused the change in your opinion? Because it's very extreme, this change, right?
Well, I mean, many factors happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Central Asian countries became independent. The Eastern Europe was no longer communist. The whole major picture changed. So China was no longer having to choose between the sort of American, anti-American, Soviet, anti-Soviet bloc. And as you will read in my book, Israel from the beginning was very, very proactive, trying to make relations with China. So even though there were no diplomatic relations, Israel would send experts, in desert agriculture. Vast areas of China have no water or very little water. So Israel would send its specialists to Gansu, Ningxia, Xinjiang, and they would do these very large projects. But none of this could ever be reported. And the vehicles they traveled in could not have Israel on them. They had to have special visas because Israeli citizens could not enter with Israeli passports. There was also cooperation in scientific fields, in medical fields, agriculture, and this was all going on before 92. So I think many departments in the government of China wanted this normalization before, but it was, I think, the foreign ministry, the political aspect, diplomatic aspect, the support for Arab countries, the need for oil from Arab countries, that is what delayed it.
Perhaps China is not as pro-Israel today as perhaps what Mark may have portrayed. But the question before was about Hong Kong, I assume, covering about Jewish issues as well. Let me tell you and end with a story which I think some of you may find amazing. 2014, I was in Israel, bringing a group of mainland Chinese business leaders some of the top Chinese leaders. And we were shot at for 7 days because Hamas was shooting. And I got back to and my wife and I saw, Hamas rockets and then the Iron Dome and bang, and then a fireball. A couple of seconds later, bang, bang, So we were living under that for every day for 7 days. And I got back to Hong Kong. The next morning, I read in the newspaper how the Israelis massacre. Is that a word? Massacring the Hamas young boys who was playing soccer at the beach. You remember that? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was amazing because I was there and I was shot at by Hamas every day. And so I wrote an article. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm nobody, but Hong Kong newspaper never turned down my articles. I've never had a Hong Kong newspaper, turn down my articles. I wrote a piece on, you know what? I didn't want to argue with anybody who's right, who's wrong. All I said was I was there for 7 days. And I would like to think that some people are interested if Ronnie Chan's life, at least in this town, Ronnie Chan's life is under threat. That's all I wrote. My helicopters are allowed to be flown by the Israeli government. Mark, you flew with me on one of those. We had to stop because they were shooting. And one dinner, we all had to go down to the bunker 3 times in one dinner. Okay? So, hey, don't you think it's newsworthy that in this town at least, where somebody knows something about this kid called Ronnie Chan, that his life was being threatened because Hamas was shooting? No Hong Kong newspaper would report it. Tell me why. Now, I understood a little bit because the first newspaper was Ming Pao. Ming Pao is owned by a Malaysian Chinese. And Malaysia being a, Muslim country, I can understand. So a couple of weeks later, I was hosting dinner at my office for the editors on behalf of the Better Hong Kong Foundation. And I told them the story. Hey, I said, what's wrong with you guys? How come you don't publish my article? 2 newspapers said to me, Hong Kong Economic Journal and Xingtao. None of them are owned by Muslims that last time I checked. And they told me, send it to us and we'll publish it. Ladies and gentlemen, none of them publish it. Why? Think about it. Last question before I can give you this book, Mark. What do you think is China's view about Israel today? You talk about Israel's view about China. They want to build relationship even before 1992. You're absolutely correct. What about China? How do they look at Israel, do you think, today?
Well, you know better than I. Israel has many strong points. It has wonderful entrepreneurs. It has great expertise in many sectors. I think China wants to tap in to these technologies, these thousands of very bright people who are building new companies, and it wants to team it up. China has enormous capital, manufacturing capacity. I mean, lots of strength within China, but China is weaker abroad. Israeli companies, they have great networks in the world. They are very good at marketing. So I think China sees Israel in an extremely positive way, and especially in the economic field, I think they would like to develop relations. But I think in diplomatic way, as I mentioned in the talk, I think that's another question. I mean, peace with the Palestinians, I think that's not something for China's priority. Yeah.
Well, 8 years ago, I see very few Chinese in Israel. Mm. But about 2 years ago, I was flying one day from Istanbul to Tel Aviv. I counted. There were 19 people in the business class. 9 of them are Chinese. And these days, you go to Israel, you can get away from the Chinese tourists. And I frankly told my Israeli government friends, I said, hey, I think we should cool it. Because, the size differential is just humongous. And when the Chinese want to come, they come in such huge amount that you can easily have a backlash. I'm serious. You know, we saw the picture of Shimon Peres, right? Another dear friend of mine, Shimon, said to me one time, he said, you know, Ronnie, you put China and Israel together, it's become a big country. Well, you laugh because the bigness comes on one side. And when that side begin to invest on the smaller side, I think we have to be careful. Otherwise, I fear that there may be a backlash. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that Mark O'Neill have done such a good job that I should give him this book?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Can we have a photo? Yeah. Thank you very much.
See you at the Imam program. Or Imam Rabbi program.